Part 1. Chapter 1. 3 Friends. Diossos was a lovely boy. Among his peers, other 11 or 12-year-olds, he stood out for his uncanny beauty. He was eye-catching. Swarthy, his eyes and hair were as dark as those of any Greek. And yet, somehow, he seemed different. Passers-by stopped to look whenever he played with other boys by the marina in Isthmia, the eastern port of Corinth. "Look, what a beautiful child," they said. But women always added, "Yes, but I would not want mine to look like that. He looks delicate, ill-nourished." And that was true. Diossos mostly went hungry. Sometimes, when he managed to catch a fish in the bay, his mother made a feast for the whole family. And then, for many days running, they had to settle for barley cake and a handful of dried broad beans. And those beans were always a bit musty, because musty beans were cheaper. Sometimes he managed to earn a few obols by scrubbing decks on great sailing galleys, or by helping to arrange dried fruit in crates for export to Phoenicia or Egypt. The wages were tiny, but he always gave everything to his mother, or rather to his sister, because his mother worked all day and returned home only late, leaving the household in the care of her daughter. And what a household that was! A couple of rooms in an old dilapidated house situated right by the port pier. A tiny garden with a few rows of beans and parsley, and one old goat, thin and always hungry like its owners. These carrions were a destitute lot. Other children called him Carrion because his mother was not Greek. Her first husband, Phaemon the driver, had brought her to Corinth from Caria in Asia Minor many years ago. Once upon a time, they lived a life of plenty, but Diossos did not remember those times. When Phaemon perished in a fire, with their house, possessions, horse, and the cart, their lives were ruined. That happened 8 years ago, and for little Diossos, poverty was all he could remember. For a short while, 3 years ago, it seemed that better times would come, because Diossos's mother remarried. But her hopes that she could improve their lot by remarrying vanished quickly. Her new husband, Diossos's stepfather Dromaeus, a guard on a great merchant galley, turned out to be a wretch. A drunkard and gambler, he spent his days playing dice with other sailors, and lost all his earnings and eventually his job. He lived for a while on his wife's wages, and by selling her possessions. But when these sources exhausted themselves, he abandoned her without scruples, disappeared for a long time, and returned only after 1.5 years. He promptly sold everything out of the house again, then moved to the opposite end of the port, and gave no further sign of life. All the while he descended lower and lower in the world, ultimately becoming a slave catcher, the most despised occupation in the world. Slave catchers hunted down runaway slaves and received a bounty for every man, woman, and child they captured. Business opportunities were plentiful because Corinth swarmed with slaves. It was the largest slave trading centre in all of Greece. Every year, Corinthian merchants sent huge shipments of live cargo to the great slave markets in the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon. And because the only land route from the Peloponnese to central Greece ran through Corinth, Helots, running from Sparta, and runaway slaves from Arcadia or Elis had to come through here, unless they somehow managed to find passage on a ship. Mostly they tried to flee to Athens, where, under the rule of the wise and honest Solon, the lives of slaves had improved. There their owners were no longer allowed to kill their property with impunity. Word of this spread widely throughout Greece. These Athenian newfangled inventions provoked indignation in aristocratic Sparta and its allied states, such as Corinth. But for the hundreds of thousands of slaves living in the Peloponnese, Attica seemed like a paradise. And so the slave catchers in frontier Corinth had their hands full, and Diossos' stepfather Dromaeus did quite well at times. But invariably he quickly spent all his wicked earnings and was soon poor again. And then he showed up again, emaciated, angry and hungry, in the home of his family, searching for something to sell, and then went away, bidden farewell by all with a sigh of relief. He inspired in them fear and disgust. He was their misfortune and their shame at the same time. Before their mother remarried, they had never had it so bad. They didn't really have friends, but they had acquaintances who liked them, took pity on them, and sometimes helped with small things. It was much worse now. Instead of need, there was dire poverty. Instead of relative social isolation, contempt. Formerly, Diossos' mother had been able to find work easily. "She is the widow of the noble Phaemon," people said. And now everyone turned away from her. "She's the wife of that slave-catcher Dromaeus," they whispered. Diossos did relatively best out of all his family. His rags did not shame him. His peers did not avoid him, and he always had someone to play with and fight with. Besides, he had two great friends. One of them was his flute. Diossos had found it a few years ago, in a grove outside the city. Someone lost it there, perhaps during Bacchanalia, when the sacred procession circled the city in drunken merrymaking. However it happened, Diossos found the flute, and from that day on it became his dearest toy and his most beloved friend. Without quite knowing when and how, the boy learned to play it. In the beginning, an old sailor helped him, showing him some fingering. His mother taught him some songs, and the rest he learned by trial and error. He went to all the ceremonies and processions, everywhere where there was singing or chorea dancing with the accompaniment of music. He collected melodies and repeated them as best he could, ineptly at first, then better and faster, and more beautifully. And thus the flute was his best friend. His other friend was his dog. The dog was named Argus, after Odysseus's famous dog, but it did not belong to Diossos at all. It belonged to Terpnos, a wealthy miller, owner of a large estate with a walled-in garden not far from their house. Terpnos was one of the most wicked and unhelpful people in all of Corinth. He exploited his workers ruthlessly. Diossos' mother, who had worked for him for a while, had to quit, not wanting to endure his humiliating treatment. Terpnos hated her from then on, calling her that blasted foreigner, and rejoiced at her increasing poverty. The bad owner had a bad dog, and the dog was the terror of the whole neighborhood. It was a great black shaggy beast, evil, trained from a puppy in hate and aggression to keep watch over Terpnos' beautiful garden. He had mauled several passers-by, and since then his reputation as the meanest dog in Corinth was established. And this dog became Diossos' second great friend. It happened this way. One day, while passing by Terpnos' garden, Diossos saw an extraordinary spectacle. A huge dog stuck on the fence. The dog must have miscalculated distance when jumping the fence, and now hung, jammed in between the stakes. His front paws did not touch the ground, and his hind legs milled in vain in search of support. He twitched and jerked, and the more he struggled, the more tightly wedged he became, causing himself unbearable pain. He had been hanging like that for a long time, whining and howling, head hanging down, his bloodshot eyes glowing with fear and despair. He was panting, and foam dripped from his mouth. Several boys walked past, saw him and laughed. A few picked up sticks and beat him. Children are often cruel, and both Terpnos and his dog were universally hated. Seeing the dog, Diossos stopped. He knew at once that this was the great Argos of the miller, but he felt sorry for the animal. He didn't stop to reflect. He just reached out to help him. But this proved difficult. Diossos was weak, and Argos was as heavy as a calf, and besides, crazed with pain at the slightest movement, he snapped his jaws at his rescuer. So Diossos clambered over the fence and pushed the dog's hind legs upwards, slowly easing him over to the other side. After a little heaving, the dog fell down, splat, right on its snout, free at last. He jumped up, dazed, turning right and left as if checking to see what had just happened. Then he barked, ran forward 100 paces, and threw himself on the ground, rolling back and forth before shaking himself and sitting up. He jumped up, did a kind of dance, stood again, and burst out in joyful barking, declaring to the whole world that he was alive and free and unscathed. The crowd of children dispersed in the blink of an eye. Only Diossos remained, proud of his good deed. He climbed back over the fence, and now he saw Argos and froze. The dog ran straight at him. Diossos went numb as he saw the huge black beast coming, but the dog, reaching him, jumped up with his paws on his shoulders, knocked him over, and then ran his enormous tongue twice over his face. He then jumped up, danced beautifully again, and disappeared around the bend in the road. Thus Diossos became acquainted with the most terrible dog in Corinth. But it wasn't friendship yet. The real friendship did not begin until a great misfortune struck a few days later. Diossos returned home one day in the evening, happy to have earned a few obols for showing a rich foreigner his way, when his sister, crying, told him the terrible news. In his absence, his stepfather had come home again, old Dromaeus, along with Terpnos. Dromaeus owed the miller a sum of money, and now he came with the creditor to his wife's house to find something to sell to pay back his debt. They rummaged around for a long time because poverty had long since swept clean all corners of the carrion's house. But in the end, they found 2 winter coats and the flute. And they took them. Diossos' sister, Euclea, a few years older than he, recounted the whole incident through tears. She related how she'd wanted to hide the cloaks because they were their only cover day and night, how she tried in vain to protect them, how she struggled with her stepfather and the wicked Terpnos, how she called them thieves and scoundrels, for which they hit her so hard that she could now hardly move her hand. She was crying, and Diossos had to comfort her. Their mother came, then their little brother, and they all heard the story again and wept. But Diossos could not easily come to terms with his loss. The cloaks? Bah! Summer was coming, and one hardly needed clothes any more. But the flute? That was terrible. That could not be allowed. During the day, Diossos hatched a plan. The boy didn't understand that, by law, a Corinthian husband could dispose of his wife's property however he liked. He only knew that the flute had been his best friend and his greatest joy, and that it had been stolen from him. Stolen! And so he decided to get it back. But because Terpnos was strong and evil, and no one would stand up for the poor boy, it followed that the only way to recover his friend was to steal him back. So when night fell, he left the house and crept silently into the miller's yard. It was sheer madness, and only utter despair could push anyone to take such a step. But Diossos was desperate. Terpnos' house was large, and Diossos, who had seen its inside only once, did not remember it too well. A house servant of the miller had told him where Terpnos had thrown his flute, and that was where Diossos was going to look. But with such information alone, it would have been difficult to find a small item even in daytime, let alone at night. Diossos was not a great burglar, and his foolish escapade ended just as it had to. Immediately after entering the house, he woke someone inadvertently, became frightened, cried out, and, blinded with fear, dashed away through the garden. Terpnos flew out after him, but he didn't intend to exhaust himself in chasing the boy, whose tiny shadow he saw perfectly clearly in the moonlight. He set the dog after the fugitive. Let the dog deal with him, he thought with satisfaction. Running pell-mell, Diossos heard the great animal's gallop and its terrifying hoarse growl behind him, and he froze with terror. He stopped helplessly just a few steps from the wall, and the dog caught up with him instantly. The dog ran up and froze. He sniffed the boy's feet, his hands, his body, stopped growling, and wagged his tail. Clearly his master had got this wrong. This was not a dangerous trespasser. The dog was puzzled. He hesitated. Then he sprang forward and began to bark at a nearby stone pillar. He meant to convey to the boy that all this chase had been completely unnecessary and, at any rate, was never directed at him. Just a stupid mistake, that's all. He barked again at the pillar, then at a tree, then at another tree, and returned to his master. Still trembling with fear, the boy had plenty of time to clamber over the wall. Huddled on the other side, he listened in horror as the evil dog was beaten by his evil master. Terpnos was furious with his dog, cursed him, kicked him, and beat him with a stick. And Argos, kicked and beaten, whined and pleaded for mercy, pretending not to know what had happened, protesting his innocence and honest confusion. But Argos knew perfectly well what had happened. His great shaggy black head had formed an unshakable decision. You want me to bite that boy? And I won't bite him. Even if you kill me, I won't bite him. If you like, I'll gladly bite 5 others. Just point them out, but not him. So the sly Argos thought to himself, patiently waiting for his master's anger to vent. As the blows continued to fall and the pain became unbearable, he got fed up and growled a brief, terrifying warning growl. Hearing it, Terpnos stopped abruptly. It was better not to risk a confrontation with the dog. Argos was as big as a wolf, and stronger than one, too. So Terpnos gave him one more parting kick and went back home, cursing. And Diossos returned home without his flute, but with a heart overflowing with tenderness and devotion. He had a rough homecoming because his mother awaited him on the threshold and, having given him first a good boxing, started to cry again. "That is just what's been missing in our misfortune. To be taken for thieves," she repeated, amid sobbing. She made him swear that he would not go into Terpnos's garden ever again to reclaim that stupid flute. Diossos promised, and kept his word. But the following evening, as soon as darkness fell, he went back again, not to the garden, but to the enclosing wall. He waited for the dog to be released from his chain, and he began to call to him, softly and tenderly. The dog appeared, sniffed and wagged his tail. The boy threw him a handful of fish bones that he had collected near one of the ships. Argos quickly dealt with the treat, then stood on his hind legs, resting his front paws on the wall. Diossos lowered his hands towards him, and dipped them confidently into the great black mane on his head and the ruff of his neck. They stayed this way for a long time, without moving. Chapter 2. Enter the Milesians. And now the port of Isthmia was very busy. For several weeks now, hundreds of sailing ships, barges, and larger and smaller galleys had been arriving every day. Crowds of visitors from all over Greece flocked on the coast and the great road leading to Corinth. The Isthmian Games were about to commence, and Corinth teemed with competitors and spectators, and still more people arrived every day in the great city between the seas. Like seabirds following a shoal of fish, merchants rush from the farthest shores to take advantage of this great gathering of humanity. Among the native Hellenes, it was easy to spot the unfamiliar features of beautifully dressed Phoenicians, volatile Etruscans, bronze-skinned Egyptians, Lydians from Asia Minor, Thracians and Syrians. How many colours, how many countries, how many different garments, headdresses, hairstyles, jewels. Eyes hurt from looking, ears from listening to those thousands of voices. Diossos walked among the crowds, constantly jostled from all sides, looking, listening, but not enjoying it. His eyes remained sad. How could he rejoice when all his work had been in vain for 10 days straight? He had come to the port every day, trying to lure a visitor to stay at their house, and nothing. Following the example of other Corinthians, the Carians, in anticipation of the crowds, had prepared their rooms to receive visitors. They cleared one room in their house and built a table and a bench, and brought straw to make a mat. These were small expenses for some, but big expenses for them. Yet they incurred them, hoping a foreigner coming for a longer stay would pay enough rent to cover all costs, and bring maybe a dozen drachmas in profits. And these drachmas, by Zeus, how they needed them! Diossos knew it well, and so he stood patiently in the port for hours, and ran up to every sailing ship and galley as it arrived. All in vain. There were always other people there already, most of them adults, loud and strong. They pushed him aside, shouted and laughed, joking with the visitors more smoothly than he ever could. And what could he do? Those people invited travellers to their places in Skoinunt or Corinth, or some nice coastal resort. And he was alone and small, and the room he offered was in a ramshackle house right at the port. And so he returned empty-handed to their little house, where his mother and his sister awaited him, ever more melancholy and sad. And it was all because of him, because of his indolence, helplessness, and stupidity. And today, or at the latest tomorrow, was his last chance to find a paying guest, because then the games would begin, and no more arrivals could be expected. Diossos did not even want to think about showing up at home empty-handed. His sister would reproach him. Naturally. Tears welled up in his eyes. He loved his sister, the 15-year-old Euclea. He considered her the most beautiful girl in the whole of Corinth, and was perhaps not wholly wrong. Euclea had that same unusual beauty as Diossos, only her hair was even darker, her complexion whiter, and her features even more delicate. Taller than her brother, she was as slender and lithe as he, and her eyes were similar, deep, dark, curious and sad. For Diossos, she was the prettiest and the wisest, the bravest, and all around the best. He never changed his mind, even when he got a boxing from her. He accepted it philosophically, understanding that his sister was his mother's deputy. Besides, his sister rarely hit him, and caressed him a lot more often. and Diossos could always take comfort in the fact that he had an even younger brother, an 8-year-old, who, in turn, had to listen to him and obey him, and whom he also caressed, only not as often, and whom he could also hit, only much more often. But now everyone, mother, sister, and brother, expected him to deliver, and he hadn't been able to. Nothing. Nothing. All day, nothing. In the late afternoon, he saw a small, beautiful sailboat pull up between two larger ships moored by the shore, and he rushed toward it. But he had little hope. In fact, he didn't have any, naturally. Already some other boys were there, 15 or 16-year-old striplings. They had beaten him to it, and were already talking to the newcomers. Diossos tried in vain to push his way forward, to say something, but no one paid attention to him, and the teenagers were already leading the arrivals away. But then, suddenly, they quarrelled among themselves, and two began fighting, and the newcomers turned to Diossos. A very tall, slim young man with pale golden hair took him by the arm. "Do you have a place to stay, little fellow?" he asked. "I do," Diossos replied quickly. "Take us, then." Diossos did not want to believe his luck. He led the way. Someone shouted, "Where are you distinguished gentlemen going? To these foreign paupers? They don't even have a stool to sit on. They are bag people." The tall man turned his gentle eyes on Diossos. "Is that true, boy?" Diossos's eyes welled up with tears. He dared not answer either yes nor no. He only said, "It's very close, good sir," and pointed to the nearby cottage. "Let's take a look," decided the other visitor, also young but stocky and broad-shouldered. And they went along. Diossos's heart trembled. Of course, the visitors would see that there was nothing there, only bare walls, 2 stools and a straw mat. And they would go away. It's not like he could magic the house into a palace. When they entered the tiny yard, he didn't dare look the splendid travellers in the eyes. But there was his sister on the threshold. Seeing the strangers, she froze in place, staring at them with amazed, frightened eyes. The visitors also stood motionless for a long time without saying a word. They entered and looked around the room. Diossos slipped in behind them. The startled Euclea explained the bathroom, the meals, the way to the games, then quickly scampered to the other room, like a modest Greek girl should. It was not fitting for a young girl to talk to strangers without witnesses and without veiling her face. And they were such young and beautiful men. The newcomers conferred with each other in an undertone. The short, dark-haired man with lively eyes wanted to look for another room. "There is really nothing here, Polynikos," he said. "It's as basic as it gets." But the latter, Polynikos, objected. "I'm not leaving," he said. "Why?" "Because, did you see that girl, Melocles?" Melocles laughed uproariously, and the tall, thin man continued in a whisper, "By all the gods, I have never seen such a prettier girl in my life." "And Anethi?" "Bah, Anethi. Anethi doesn't count. She's my sister." They discussed something in whispers, but the decision had already been made. They would stay. That day, Diossos had a mountain of work. He had to run to the sailboat a score of times to bring various bags, packages, crates, vessels, pitchers, coats, food. Apart from the 2 young visitors, there was another man on the ship, an old sailor, squinting and grouchy, and a young boy, a servant. By evening, Diossos knew everything. The name of the boat was Anithi. She belonged to the younger, shorter man, who nevertheless seemed the most important of them all. The taller man was his brother-in-law, his wife's brother, and a friend, and the third man, the old fellow, was a steersman on the boat. He knew that they had come all the way from Miletus in Ionia, in Asia Minor, and that this slim, tall man, whose name was Polynikos, was to stand in the games as a competitor, as a long-distance runner. Diossos looked at him with admiration. Thanks to him, and only to him, the visitors had noticed Diossos in the first place, and then came to the house and decided to take the room. Diossos heard it clearly when Polynikos called his sister the most beautiful girl in the world, and his heart filled with pride and gratitude to the newcomer for saying this. He was not abashed by this tall man. Indeed, Polynikos could not cause fear in anyone. Gentle, with a childish face, a delicate, shy smile, golden hair, and bright blue eyes, he always seemed cheerful and a little shy. Who could fear him? And at the same time he was an athlete, a competitor in the Isthmian Games, chosen from among thousands, perhaps even a future champion. And Polynikos, seeing the delight and trust in the boy's face, smiled at him and talked to him as if they were equals. The boy's adoration amused him, and his extraordinary beauty touched him, and he wanted to learn something about his beautiful sister, Euclea. At supper time, Polynikos sat Diossos down on the bench beside him, and made him eat and drink along with them. Diossos, who had not yet learned the taste of wine, white bread, or smoked fish, could not get enough of their fare. He grew familiar with his elder companion, and when questioned, he began to talk about all his worries, troubles, poverty, his wicked stepfather who took everything from the house to sell, and his flute. Hearing those confessions from the other room, Euclea summoned Diossos and sternly rebuked him for telling strangers such things. "He is not a stranger," the boy said, surprised. "I already know him well, and I like him. And you should like him too," he added after a moment. "Why?" "Because he is good and great, and he is a competitor in the games, and because he likes you. I heard him say to the other fellow, the black-haired one, that you are the most beautiful girl he has ever seen. He said it really, really quietly, but I heard it anyway. See?" The girl said nothing to that, but she blushed scarlet red and turned away quickly. When, some time later, she had to go out to the guests to pour wine for them, a veil covered her face, hiding her blush of embarrassment, confusion, and anxiety. Fortunately, her mother's arrival saved her from the trouble of ministering to the two strangers any longer. The mother sent Diossos out of the room, but the boy snuck back in on some excuse. He could not give up such an opportunity to look at real sailors and real competitors and listen to their conversation. But the day, though already so good for the Carians, brought another important and welcome event. As they sat there dining, there was a sudden commotion at the front door. Diossos went outside. A big, fat, richly dressed man stood there, and with him was a teenage boy and a huge Thracian slave carrying a heavy basket. "Is the worthy Melocles of Miletus staying here?" the newcomer asked in an imperious voice. Diossos went numb. So, these Miletus sailors were dignitaries. Oh, Zeus! Without waiting for an answer, the newcomer pushed Diossos aside and went in, filling the whole door with his ample frame. The young men sprang to their feet at the sight, and the smaller, Melocles, shouted for joy and threw himself into the fat man's open arms. Callias! Callias, how did you come here? How did you find us?" The fat, powerful visitor was also clearly pleased. He gasped with satisfaction as he examined the young men, and slapped Melicles hard on the shoulder. "Well, well, so you're married, my boy?" "Yes, I'm married." "With that, what's her name, his sister, Diomedes' daughter, Anethe, yes?" Melicles smiled. "Yes, with her. And now we have a son. He can walk already. No, he runs." "Splendid!" Callias laughed out loud. "He'll grow up to be a sport like his father, you'll see. It's a good thing that you married, my boy, because marriage makes man serious and dignified in the eyes of others, and that is the most important thing in trade. A big, serious merchant like me could not consort with some inconsequential whelp. But with a father and head of a family, that's a different story. Now we can drink together as equals." Melicles started pouring wine, and Callias, spreading himself on a stool, looked around. "Couldn't you find a better place to stay than this hovel?" he asked. Melicles shrugged. "Polynikos insisted on staying here." "Why? This is a dive." "That is exactly why. Polynikos said we would disappoint and shame the host if we left. He's a lamb, you know." "And what do you care about the hosts?" Nothing about the hosts, Callias. But they have a daughter, and she's pretty." Callias laughed uproariously. "Well then, that's different, Polynikos. I didn't realize you were such a connoisseur." "Polynikos, my friend, here is my principal worry. Polynikos has such a good heart that, when he dashes ahead in the race, he will probably start feeling bad about his competitors, stop and give them time to catch up." Callias turned curiously to Polynikos. "You are in the games, Polynikos? In pancration?" "The long-distance run." "Apollo's liar. Your legs are long enough. They start at your neck and go all the way to the ground. But this is an honour, a great honour to compete." Polynikos suddenly gained respect in his eyes. "I mean, seriously, every competitor is a winner already. There's glory in merely participating. This thing here in Corinth is not the Olympic Games of Elias, but these are right and famous games, not bad at all. And a celery wreath is every inch as glorious as the laurel wreath. Why haven't you come earlier, though? You could have used a longer workout in the gymnasium, and familiarise yourself with the venue and your competitors. You know, to see their strengths and strategies." But Melicles went back to his first question. "We arrived only at noon today. How did you find us so quickly?" Callias shrugged. "There was no art to it. I came to the port with my man to buy a box of spices directly from a ship, and maybe some Cypriot wine. And I see this very nice little sailboat there, and she sure looks familiar. I think to myself, I recognise that mast. And on its side it says, for all to see, Anethe. So, Anethe, I say to myself. There is a name one does not hear every day. And so I ask, whose boat is this? And they say, Melicles of Miletus. I see, I say. So, Where is he then? And they point out this hole in the wall to me, and here I am. That's all. In truth, you should be the ones calling on me, because I am as old as the two of you combined. But I don't stand on ceremony." "Have you a slave?" asked Polynikos. "Yes, my friend, and even a few," said Callias with an owner's pride. "Well, to tell the truth, it isn't me who owns them, but our company. Because, you see, I am now a co-owner of the ship. I bet, by the way, no boat as beautiful as mine has ever been seen in Corinth. Even in Syracuse you won't find its equal." "And are you here often?" "Several times a year. It's become my second home. It's a beautiful city, just beautiful. Only there is a huge mass of cheats here, so you have to look out." Here Melocles suddenly grew serious and said, "It must be strange to have slaves in the house. You know, I don't know that I ever could have any. I would never want to see their eyes looking at me with envy. Think about it, Callias. I was a slave myself for a year before you bought me out." Callias pouted impatiently. "Nonsense," he said. "My slaves are barbarians, not Greeks. And besides, they are doing well in my service. They're well fed, and their skin glows on them like a dog's nostril." Polynikos shook his head. "But they always feel their misery." "What misery? Who is hurting them? I do not bully my slaves because it is stupid to do so. If your slaves aren't happy, well, you know, they serve you your food and are often awake when you are asleep. You are literally trusting them with your life when you take them into your house. So, if you know what is good for you, you better keep your slaves happy. But there are all sorts. There are all these people who are mean to their slaves because that makes them feel superior. That's just dumb. My Thracian is a case in point. Listen to this story. So, I'm staying here with this merchant, Antinous, in Corinth, a well-known merchant and one hell of a fraudster. Naturally, he has ripped me off big time, charging me for each day of stay and each and every service. My, may the good god Hermes remember. But I endured it all because I needed his contacts. For the time being, of course. Well, this Antinous had a cook, a slave, a Thracian. The scoundrel is as ugly as a monkey, tattooed up to his eyeballs, and has a rotten attitude. But in the kitchen, he is a poet. He cooks so well that his dinners would not shame the Babylonian court. Believe me, no one knows these things better than I do. But this Antinous does not understand what a treasure he's got. And he beats his man for the slightest thing. Beats him! And he forbids him to eat his own cooking. Imagine, his cook is not allowed to eat what he cooks. My dog is better off, Melocles. My dog, I say. So, I think to myself, it would be really nice to have such a cook on my ship. And at home, too, when I am back in Syracuse. If I can have this fellow, well, then I can receive people as they should be received. So, I offer Antinous good value for him, 60 drachmas. And Antinous laughs at that. 120 drachmas, he says, or nothing. Wait, I think to myself, you just wait. Not a peep about that cook any more. But I called my slaves, the fellows on my ship, and I sent them to do some work on Antinous. I tell them, talk to this cook in your own way. Tell him how it is with me, honestly. They chatted. So, then I talk to this cook. I tell him, would you like to come into my service? And he folds his hands in prayer to buy him. So I say to him, I cannot redeem you from your owner because he's asking too much money. But maybe we can figure this out. We talked, but nothing yet. Quiet. 1 week passes, 2 weeks, and guess what happens? Our friend, the cook, becomes ill. His eyes grow teary. He can't see very well. He's losing weight. He doesn't want to eat. And then the crowning moment. He begins to spit blood. Not good. 3 days later, Antinous comes to me and asks, by the way of something else, totally offhand, do I still want his cook? You get it, right? A sick slave. A fellow standing over his grave, spitting blood. That miscreant, that crook. I mean, Antinous, that is. So, I say, I'm a little short of cash, but I can give you 50 drachmas for the man. He jumps up. You were offering 60 only 5 weeks ago. Yes, I say, but that was then, and now is now. I can see your man looks poorly, thin and pale. Maybe he is sick or something. Maybe if I eat his food I catch something. I will not give more. We bargained for a long time, but I persisted and bought him for 50 drachmas. And now I have him. That's the giant standing there in the backyard. But if he's that sick... Callias laughed. He, as soon as he came on my ship, he sat down and ate so much that I was afraid he would burst. He was really famished after those 3 weeks of starvation. And the blood? What about the spitting of blood? Ha! That was the masterstroke. Is there ever a shortage of blood in the kitchen? You kill a chicken and you have blood. How hard is it to spit that? The fellow is as healthy as a fish, happy, glad to be in my service. No whipping, eats whatever he wants, as much as he wants. My dinners are fantastic, and the crew can't have enough of his stuff. I'm telling you, he's a jewel, not a cook. And that for 50 drachmas. And besides, it's easy to like him. He's a cheerful, clever rascal, and, it turns out, worth a far better fate than serving a wretch like Antinous. General laughter erupted. Callias continued. You must come to me for a feast. The day after tomorrow. Come on the ship, because now I live there. You'll see how I live. I live like a king. Why on earth should I stay with Antinous when he can't even serve me a proper supper? There is no decent cook in his house. So, my friends, are you coming? I will come for sure, said Melocles, but I do not know if Polynikos can. Polynikos shook his head. No, I will not be allowed to, he replied. From tomorrow on, I must be in the gymnasium with other competitors. We will be required to remain on the hallowed ground and not allowed to go out. The games will start in 3 days. Why do you only come now? It's all because of him, said Melocles, pointing to Polynikos. The man is more than 20, but bashful as a child. There were qualifying trials in Miletus for a month. I tell him, Go, try out, you run well. To which he says, There are much better than me. and he kept delaying. At last, he agreed to stand only on the last day during final selections. He stood immediately with the fastest group. They did not want to let him in at first. They laughed at him. I was there. Polynikos was red with shame and anger, but he insisted. And imagine, he came first by 20 paces. What distance? Long race. 16 stadiums. Ha! 20 paces. By the fast-legged Achilles, they must have felt stupid. Of course, they insisted on rerunning the race. So he beat them again, even better this time. Then they realised what treasure they had and decided to send him right away. Well then, we'll see you at the stadium, and may Zeus help you, and Hermes, God's light-footed messenger. Just hold on tight, my boy, and train hard. Not just anybody's here, you know. Probably the best is Cleomenes the Athenian, an incomparable runner. He's taken laurels at 2 Olympiads in a row. 2 Olympiads running, so to speak. Yes, I've heard. In a race against him, I would be proud to come in second. Oh, yes, and even that itself would be great glory. Besides, this is your first time, so you cannot reasonably expect to do more. It is a great honour already to be sent by Miletus. Anyway, you will come to me right after the competition, yes? We will come for sure. Well then, and now to the health of the future winner. And then he threw his arm around Polynikos' neck. Polynikos, he said, you are a fine fellow, and I am sure that you will win. I knew very little of your father, but I knew your uncle, Philemon, in Memphis, and, by all gods, he was one worthy man. And what a merchant! Do you remember Melocles? Yes, Philemon was a right proper merchant. Not like the crooks you find here in Corinth. Antinous, for example, price-fixer, trickster, and a fool. Callias blushed and slammed his fist on the table. A fool, I say. He lost such a cook, and for almost nothing, for 50 drachmas. And all he had to do was be nice to his man. And he's supposed to be a merchant. It's shameful to even think about it. Callias pondered, resting his heavy head on his hands. Yes, he whispered, still softer. Terrible cheats here in this Corinth. Terrible. At midnight, Polynikos carried the sleeping Diossos to the adjoining room and handed him to his mother. Chapter 3. The Great Isthmian Games. It's the 3rd day of the Isthmian Games. Diossos has been at his post since daybreak. 2 days ago, he spotted a few good trees growing at the edge of the sacred grove, and has now been sitting in one of them since dawn, not moving from his branch, not letting anyone push him away. And now, all the nearby trees, from their lowest branches right up to their tops, are hung with boys. The grown-ups below look at them with envy, ruining the gravitas of their social position, which does not allow them to climb trees. A sea of heads surrounds Diossos. The audience is packed on 3 sides of a small stadium. The stadium itself lies in a small depression, its slopes forming a natural amphitheatre. On the 4th, far side, there is a steep slope. There are no crowds there because that's the hallowed ground, the location of the gymnasium and the palaestra. To the right, and slightly lower, stands the small, ancient, and very holy shrine of Poseidon, revered by Corinthians since times immemorial. Lower yet, and quite near the stadium, a great marble altar was erected a few years ago, on which ceremonial offerings take place on the opening day of the Games. "They are coming! They are coming!" Suddenly the crowd falls silent, freezes, holds its breath. The sacred procession descends slowly from the steps of the gymnasium in a measured, grave, ceremonial step, down towards the stadium. At its head come priests in long white robes and gilded wreaths on their heads. Then come the referees, the Hellanodikai, then the directors of the gymnasium and the palaestra, and finally the competitors. They stand out from all the others because of the glowing gold of their bodies. They are completely naked. There is a murmur in the crowd at their sight. People whisper the names of the most famous athletes: Cleomenes of Athens, Tisicrates of Corinth. Soon, however, these whispers stop, and silence falls again. Passing by the altar of Zeus, the priests stop and bow their heads. All understand that this is the great moment. If ever, then now, today, the gods are here among the mortals. They are here to admire their performance and share their joy. The usual miserable human troubles, everyday affairs and cares are not worthy of the attention of the gods. But the games, oh yes, the games are different. It's hard to imagine that the gods would not want to feast their eyes on such a delight. So, they are here for sure, inaudible and invisible, to see for themselves these gorgeous bodies, chosen from thousands equally beautiful across the Greek world, to see for themselves what the mortals managed to achieve with the gifts of life, health, and wisdom bestowed upon them by heaven. The competitors are now in the stadium. The audience tries to make out the most important among them, but it's too far away, and Diossos cannot recognize individual faces. Diossos leans as far forward as he can, but he still can't recognize anyone. There are some very tall men among the competitors. One of them must be Polynikos. That one, perhaps, with a fair head, standing a bit off to one side. Diossos straightens up, stretches his neck as far as it will go, and brushes the head of a man standing under the tree with his heel. The grey-haired, dignified, bearded gentleman looks at him indignantly. "If you kick me again, brat," he calls out angrily, "I will tear your leg off." Terrified, Diossos huddles at his post. A burst of laughter runs through the group of boys sitting on his branch. Then Diossos notices his new friend, Melocles of Miletus, standing a dozen steps away, and Melocles notices him too, and waves to him, smiling. In the few days since their arrival, Diossos has become so close to the Milesians as if he had known them for years. He's looked up to Polynikos as if he were a deity from the beginning, but Melocles frightened him somewhat at first. But in time he won over the boy's heart completely. First, because he was a friend of Polynikos, and second, because he was such a good friend. Diossos only now grasped what that big word meant: friendship. Melocles visited Polynikos' gymnasium several times a day, brought him oil and fruit and fish, and inquired carefully about the day's events. He encouraged him and advised him, and he stepped in when Polynikos started having difficulties with the Hellanodikai. The referees of the games, among whose tasks it was to limit access to the games to Greek participants only, took a dim view of Polynikos' golden hair and fair skin. Polynikos did not look very Greek. The fact that he had been born in faraway Egypt cast a shadow of suspicion on his origin, and his speech retained traces of the Egyptian accent. These facts, and the pedigree presented by Polynikos, did not seem quite convincing to the judges. Only the testimony of two senior men, who had known Polynikos' father, convinced them. These witnesses were Callias and Leptones, one of the great merchants of Miletus. Finding these witnesses at the last minute was largely the accomplishment of Melocles, so it was really only thanks to him that Polynikos, who had already resigned himself to rejection, was admitted to the games after all. On the day of the trial runs, when the weaker competitors were eliminated, Melocles did not leave his friend for a moment. He encouraged him, advised him, served him, and was happy like a child when Polynikos passed. That day was an important one for Melocles. After he returned home to the Carians, he talked for a long time with pride and enthusiasm about how Polynikos scored very well in those test runs, immediately attracting the attention of the gymnasium's directors. Seeing all this, Diossos decided to forgive Melocles for what had at first offended him, namely that he ordered his long-legged friend about, treating him as an underage brother. That seemed all wrong to Diossos, since Melocles was probably not older than Polynikos. He was at most 24, and yet everyone, Polynikos, the old steersman Koroibos, Callias, and even Diossos' mother, treated him as if he were the senior of the two. Anyway, Diossos now liked Melocles, and dared ask him how it was in this great gymnasium, how the trial runs went, what Polynikos was doing, and whether he was well and of good cheer. And Melocles answered him patiently, smiling, knowing that he probably could not find a more eager listener for his news anywhere in the world. So now, seeing that familiar, kind face in the crowd nearby, Diossos brightens and takes heart. I am not the only one who believes in Polynikos' victory, he thinks. Meanwhile, there is a commotion in the crowd, followed by a sudden silence. Everyone holds their breath. The first run has started. Polynikos is not in it. This is the so-called short run, the distance of just one stadion. The competitors immediately launch at their top speed, like stones flung by slings. At first, they run in a tight group, but soon 2 runners begin to move to the fore. They lean forward at the turnaround and lunge towards the finish. Cleomenes of Athens! Tisicrates of Corinth! Shout voices. It's as if someone suddenly lit a huge fire under the crowd. They begin to shout and whistle and toot and wave their arms and jump up and down. Tisicrates is a Corinthian and the city's favourite. Most of the audience are Corinthians, his acquaintances and friends and relatives. They make such a racket that they completely drown out the not-so-numerous Athenians. But it doesn't help. After the runners clear the turnaround, Cleomenes leans forward sharply, moves into lead like lightning, and does not let his victory slip away. He shoots through the finish line first, followed immediately by Tisicrates, and then all the others only several paces behind. A storm of applause breaks out in the crowd, and the Corinthians join in the cheering. They are allowed to wish their home player victory, root for him and applaud him, but to refuse to admit that Cleomenes is a superb runner, a role model for all competitors, and today the champion of all Hellas, would be a sin. And anyway, the Corinthians take comfort in the fact that the other contest remains undecided. Both Tisicrates and Cleomenes will match again in the long-distance run. Then we will see who the real champion is, they say. Meanwhile, the stadium is busy again. Another group of competitors sets out to run. These men did not compete for the short-run title, but because they will participate in the long-distance run, along with those who did, they are required to run their stadium now to make sure that everyone has made an equal effort. Fairness demands it. They don't run very fast. They try to preserve their energy for the main event. But they do try to show the beauty of their movements, taut muscles and gorgeous form. And besides, no one wants to come in last. The viewers applaud the most beautiful. call out their favourites, and infer from their movements the relative worth of each runner. This group includes Polynikos. When the group runs closest to him at the turn of the stadium, Diossos recognizes him clearly. He is taller than the others, and his body glows like ivory. He outshines the rest. And that long blonde hair, it catches the eye from far away. "That blonde fellow is running nicely," someone says. "It's Polynikos of Miletus," shouts Diossos, beaming and as loud as his childish, squeaky voice will carry. Laughter burst out. Someone mocks him mercilessly. Yeah, Polynikos is that really famous champion. You will see that he comes in first, from the back." Diossos is red with shame and wants to sink underground. But suddenly the same voice who noticed Polynikos says calmly, "A gymnasium instructor told me about this new fellow from Miletus. It seems we may all be up for a surprise today." All laughter stops. Diossos radiates with happiness now. If he could, he would hug that stranger whose face he can't even see. Then he notices Melocles' face again. Melocles gives him a sign with his hand. Now, the race is on. There are more competitors in this race than in the first. Initially, they take off in a chaotic mass, and it is difficult to tell them apart. But right after the first turnaround, the tightly packed group begins to stretch into a kind of snake, and the snake lengthens with every passing moment. Polynikos is right in the centre of the snake, perhaps just a tad closer to its head. He is fifth, maybe sixth. Diossos recognizes him clearly, and now he does not take his eyes off him. The runners take their time, preserving their energy. Their movements are measured and perfectly controlled. They have to last the first 15 stadions and then dash during the 16th. Thus, they run the first lap, the second, the third. The order still remains more or less the same. The snake even shortens a little as the runners from the back catch up. In the crowd, there is now total silence. No shouting, no talking, only a few whispers. The 6th, the 7th lap. Polynikos falls somewhat behind. Diossos bites his lips. The 8th lap. Suddenly, there is a murmur among the audience. Something is happening in the stadium. One of the players accelerates his pace and gradually moves up from the centre of the snake towards the head. He is now third, now second, and finally, "Tisicrates!" the crowd roars. Tisicrates takes the lead. Corinthians cannot suppress an outburst of joy at the sight of their compatriot in the lead. "Corinth! Corinth!" roar hoarse throats. But the old bearded man standing underneath Diossos whispers softly, "He started too early. He'll get winded." The 10th lap. A shiver passes through the crowd. The runner's movements are now suddenly faster, more feverish. Tisicrates is still at the forefront. Just a dozen or so steps behind him is a small group of competitors, then a break, and then the rest. Polynikos is now in that middle group, but Diossos cannot see him well. Other runners obscure him. All he can see is a mass of bodies, flashing thighs, calves and arms. Faster and faster. 12th lap. Again a shout runs through the crowd. Out of the middle group, a single runner breaks out and begins to close in on Tisicrates. "Cleomenes! The Athenian! Cleomenes! Cleomenes! Cleomenes!" Now comes the bout. Someone suddenly whispers next to Diossos. But in the wake of Cleomenes, out of the middle group, there now emerges another runner. His blonde hair blows behind him, his body as white as ivory. "Polynikos!" Diossos shouts wildly and kicks the bearded man in the head. But the man does not notice. He is too absorbed in the race. Cleomenes now draws up right next to Tisicrates. "Corinth!" scream thousands of despairing fans. Corinth! Their hearts race. They pant and tremble with tension, as if they were now out there in the stadium, running. All in vain. Tisicrates grows tired. He seized leadership too early. He now flags and falls behind. He is no longer the first. Now he is the second. Now third. In a moment, he will be fourth. The 14th lap. Cleomenes is in the lead. But no! By all the gods! What was this? The glowing one, that glowing ray of sunlight, which until now followed Cleomenes, suddenly moves forward, clears the turnaround beautifully, and accelerates as others slow down. The crowd freezes in amazement. Whispers and questions run through the audience. Who is it, by Achilles? Who is it? It's Polynikos, someone in the crowd shouts. This is the voice of Melocles. Polynikos of Miletus. Miletus! The crowd of Corinthians picks up at once. If their man must lose, well, let Cleomenes lose too. Anyone but Cleomenes, they repeat fiercely. Cleomenes does not intend to give up easily. He still has 2 stadions ahead of him. He will let this youngster lead through the 15th lap, wind himself, then take him out. But in the 16th lap, well, the 16th is the curtains. We will see about that. The distance between him and Polynikos begins to shrink. Now the old man will show his stuff, someone whispers nearby. The old man is, of course, Cleomenes. The Athenian is only 30, but he has taken laurels in various games for 8 years now. Everyone knows him, so he is the old man. The crowd falls silent. The silence is now so complete that one can hear, it seems, the patter of feet in the stadium. Everyone watches the action with bated breath. And now, the final turnaround. Only half a stadium left. Polynikos is still in front, but the Athenian is right behind him. 2 steps. 1. And now? He'll take him. But no! Polynikos, feeling his opponent's breath at his neck, desperately breaks forward. He only has several dozen steps to go. He must endure. He has to. The crowd gasps. There is a stunned silence, and then, into that silence, like into an empty jar, someone shouts, Miletus! And the crowd suddenly sways as if blown by the wind and bursts out in cheering. Fog obscures Diossos' eyes. Both runners reached the finish line together. They were so close that he couldn't see who came in first. But those in front, sitting on the stone benches around the stadium, have no doubt. Miletus! Miletus! Polynikos of Miletus! They scream. The roar of applause drowns out everything. Diossos wants to run, scream, and clap his hands all at once. He lets go of his branch and suddenly falls like a ripe fruit, right on the head of the bearded man standing below. But he is not angry about it at all. He grabs the boy in his arms and lifts him up. Miletus! He yells in a hoarse voice. Diossos embraces his neck as tight as he can. Polynikos won! He squeals in his ear. Cleomenes lost, replies the bearded man. And then Diossos somehow travels forward, overhead, lifted from hand to hand by the cheerful spectators, until he finally lands safely in Melocles' strong arms. And so ends the 3rd day of the Isthmian Games. Chapter 4. A Feast to Remember. For the rest of his life, Polynikos would remember the next few days like a bout of fever. Continuous celebrations, holy processions, feasts in the Prytaneon, visits from distinguished guests, all brought him to such a state of daze and exhaustion that he only dreamed of one thing: to run away and hide. When he at last came to his senses, that is, to the house of the Carians, he shut himself up in their room and begged Melocles not to let anyone in. So Melocles explained to all visitors, and there was no shortage of them, that the great athlete was sick and took no calls. Then at nightfall, when the endless procession of devotees who had pressed to see as little as his sandal finally went away, his friends assembled at his table, and he told them everything, time and again. Only Melocles, the old steersman Coroebos, and Diossos belonged to that charmed circle. And now a pair of oxen could not drag Diossos out of that room. Apart from the three of them, one more person listened to these stories: Euclea, who remained all evening behind the linen curtain separating the two rooms. In its shadow and in complete silence, she greedily drank every word from the champion's lips. Whole evenings passed that way. Polynikos felt good in this room. He did not want to hear about any celebrations, meetings, or feasts, for, although the official days of the games were over, celebrations in honor of the competitors went on. In the next few days, just such a thing was expected: a sumptuous reception arranged by the leading citizens of Corinth. A great local notable, Agamemnes, a member of the Creonid family, a merchant famed throughout Greece and heir to great estates, vineyards, and gardens, was to host this year's event. It was an honor to participate in such a feast, and only the most distinguished local citizens and the most respected guests had been invited. Agamemnes came from a great family and was related to the mightiest lords of Corinth. And not only of Corinth. He once held the high office of Ephor, and thus he exercised a lot of influence over the government and its international relations. But Polynikos was fed up with all these celebrations, and though he was invited as one of the champions, he absolutely refused to attend. In vain did Melocles try to persuade him. In vain did old Coroebos plead with him to overcome his dislike of crowds. Polynikos resisted. "I am not suitable for such a life," he said. "I am not suitable for the company of such people at all. Great lords, I don't know what to say, what to do, or how to behave. Leave me alone, friends." Finally, Callias, who showed up the next day, convinced him. Only after a great effort did he manage to get himself invited, and his eyes bulged with astonishment to hear that there was someone who, though he was invited, did not want to participate in such a symposium. They invited him, and he didn't want to go? What kind of nonsense was that? He was indignant. "By all the immortal gods," he boomed. "Do you understand, Polynikos, what a feast that is? What a house that is? You will remember this feast for as long as you live, and you will tell your grandchildren about it one day. You say you are tired of all these celebrations, and yes, I get it. But by Bacchus, the Agamemnes feast is not a party for judges and priests. And what kind of music will be there? What lute players? What dancers? What poetry? And what wine? Oh, what wine! By Bacchus, I tell you, you'll be mocked if you do not go. And I'll be the first to mock you. Then they will learn in Miletus that you did not attend, and they will think that maybe you weren't invited, or that you don't know how to behave in society, or something like that. And so you will bring shame on your own city." This last argument seemed to convince Polynikos. Or maybe the ordinary curiosity of the young prevailed. In any case, he was finally persuaded. Still, on his way to the feast, in his festive dress, he repeated to Mellocles, "I'm telling you, I am not fit for these things. I'm completely unfit. You'll see." The house, or rather the palace of Agamemnes, would have dazzled the richest lords of those rough times. Its oblong paved courtyard, surrounded by a colonnaded cloister, was full of people. Between two rows of small fountains, distinguished guests in white but colourfully trimmed robes mingled. At the edges, beneath the columns and swathed in garlands of laurels and flowers, stood a line of slaves. At the entrance from the courtyard to the Megaron stood the host himself, Agamemnes, greeting the arriving guests. Next to him, two half-naked female slaves held baskets with wreaths of flowers. Agamemnes placed one on each new guest's head. And while he did that, another slave called out the name and family of the visitor as he entered the Megaron. Other servants showed him to his seat. Polynikos, stunned by all this, was glad when he finally, somehow, found himself at his seat, and all the more glad when he saw that he had been assigned a place between Cleomenes and Chilon. Chilon was the famed and now retired coach of the Athenian team. Polynikos knew both of them well from the gymnasium, and both had been kind to him. With the rare impartiality of a truly great athlete, Cleomenes did not nurture resentment for his defeat. On the contrary, he seemed interested in Polynikos. He asked him questions, gave him advice and explanations, and declared only one desire: to face him again in Athens or some other Pan-Hellenic games. Chilon, a famous runner decades ago, had been delighted with Polynikos' form even before the decisive day, and had pointed him out to his team as a model of the perfect form. Now, seeing the young man's embarrassment, he took him in hand, explaining in turn who the various people around them were. The room, which could accommodate about 200 people, was already full. Guests sat in threes or fours at small three-legged tables. The most worthy had been seated in great, exquisitely carved chairs called thrones. Everyone else was on benches decorated with bronze. Before them, flowers were arranged on pink marble tables. The columns surrounding the hall were draped with garlands of flowers. Polynikos' eyes sparkled as he admired all these splendours, the whiteness of the garments of the distinguished guests, the red of the flowers. Chilon, leaning towards him, pointed out, with his gaze on those sitting close to him, the dignified throne guests. "That there, in the place of honour, trembling with age, grey-haired, sick and shrunken, is the archon Basileus. That is, the most important official in Corinth. A bit like a king and a bit like a high priest. But, in fact, he is a mindless doll, a demented fool who can't even eat by himself. Others rule for him. Myron, Lysias, he is the archon Polemarch, and this here, Agamemnes, the host who gave you your wreath at the entrance. And there, the tall one with the magnificent snow beard, dignified and noble. Who is he?" "That is Demetrion, once chief strategos of Corinth and commander of the fleet. Not too long, though, because he was then kicked out for egregious embezzlement. He made a nice packet, though, and kept it. A model of Corinthian citizenship." Then Polynikos noticed a reveller seated closest to them. He was an impressive man, not very tall, very obese, with powerful shoulders, and an even more powerful belly. In his big face, sweaty and red, bulged gigantic eyes, bloodshot, almost out of their sockets like monstrous plums. His head was completely bald, and rested stiffly on the folds of a fat neck. He had a short beard, sparse as a goat's, and thick, moist lips. All of this formed a strange mask, monstrous and funny at the same time. "Who is that fellow there, with a fat, satyr's face?" he asked Kylon. "Shh! Not so loud. That is Koreos, Agamemnes' brother. Actually, I'm not sure if they are birth brothers or only first cousins. I think he is the richest of them all, and also the greatest thief. A villain and a cruel man. He does not hold any office because, if he did, he would have to pretend to be honest, and he doesn't want to bother." "What does he do?" "Why, he trades in slaves, of course. He is the biggest slave trader in Corinth, and probably in all of Greece. Besides that, he does everything any honest man would shudder to think of." Polynikos laughed. "Nice company here." Great people, young man." Cleomenes leaned towards them. "Don't listen to Kylon too much, Polynikos. He is deliberately exaggerating. As a Democrat, he hates rich people and wants to see something revolting in each of them." Kylon huffed. "I am not saying this as a Democrat, but as an old man who has seen a lot of life. Oh, you youth! I have learned a lot in my lifetime, and most of it has not been very inspiring." "And Solon? What do you think about him?" Solon? Well, he is a great man. A holy man sent to us by the gods. But since he left Athens, things have not gone well for us." "Don't complain, Kylon. Ever since you were passed by for a judgeship, you have been bitter, and nothing seems worthy of your approval." Upon saying this, Cleomenes laughed. Kylon seemed irritated and fell silent. Polynikos continued to look around the room. His attention turned to 4 men seated at a table to the right of them. They talked in low voices. In their movements, soft and composed, in their respectful manner of addressing the servants and their neighbours, in their every gesture, there was something gentle and delicate and radically different from the brutal self-confidence of other revellers. The softness in their manners attracted the attention of those around them. "And those 4, who are they?" Polynikos asked in a whisper. Kylon looked at him in surprise. "By Hermes, I should rather ask you. These are Ionians, your relatives from Asia Minor. The oldest one, that one there, is Gorgias, the brother of Thales the Milesian, and like his brother, a sage, a philosopher and an astronomer. His eyesight is poor from all that staring at the stars all night. He's an odd fish, but a great man and a worthy heir to his brother's wisdom. And about his brother, Thales, Solon himself said he had never met a wiser man. And that was Solon speaking, mind you. And the one now talking to him is Hipponax of Ephesus. He's a poet, a singer and a great wag. Young, but famous already, because he has tormented many important people with his epigrams. I know him. He brought a whole scroll of his poems today, they say. And of his friend, the poetess Sappho. Women composing poems. What a capital idea. He will read these poems tonight. If he does, listen up, because he's worth listening to. I don't know the other 2, but they must also be special, because they have the eyes of people who have seen the gods. Deep, wise eyes. You will not find such among the local Corinthian merchants." Polynikos nodded, but after a while he said, "Maybe, but they look at everyone with such kindness and indulgence, such condescension, as if they were speaking to barbarians or children. Because they are. What can such Gorgias talk about with any Spartan who can't even read? Or with some Corinthian merchant of cattle? By all the gods, they are right. We would all need a lot of work to catch up with them. Meanwhile, there was a commotion. Servants started bringing in the food. The feast began. And now the warm smell of meat, melted fat and hot spices mingled with the scent of flowers and expensive Syrian perfumes. The air grew heavy and stuffy. Faces reddened. Polynikos watched curiously as droplets of sweat began to form on the greasy, bald head of Koreos. The dignified banker ate greedily, smacking his fat lips. 2 young slaves, still children and as beautiful as fairies, ministered to him, skillfully serving him his food the way he liked it. Koreos was quite a gourmand, and brought his own slaves to every feast, slaves who knew his tastes and worked to assure him the greatest possible pleasure. Polynikos noticed the striking beauty of these children. One of them, with a dark complexion and dark wavy hair, seemed as if strewn with gold. He reminded him of Diossos. Only in his black, big eyes, apart from sadness, something else lurked. Fear. It was the alert fear of a dog, watching for the slightest twitch of anger on his master's face. It was an unpleasant sight, and Polynikos turned away from it with distaste. The first part of the feast was almost over. It was getting dark. The servants brought in the last, 6th dish of the night, and other servants began to light lamps hanging on chains above the revellers. The eagerly awaited second part of the feast was about to begin, the symposium, beloved and adored by all Greeks. Long hours of sweet wine, sweet cakes, sweet songs, stories and dance. Symposium! 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 Called out various voices. Faces lit up. There was a commotion, the sonorous gurgling of wine mixed in craters, and poured out into serving cups delighted the hearts of the guests. The strings of a lyre and kitharas rang out, tuned by the impatient hands of musicians. Hipponax reached for the scroll at his side and began to look through it. He was to read his new poem at the opening of the symposium. Meanwhile, a gorgeously shaped, matte gold Lydian crater, richly decorated with chasing, was brought in and set in the centre of the room. This contained no wine, only small shards of pottery on which the names of guests were written. One of them would be drawn to determine who was to become the king of the feast, the symposiarch. By custom, only after that solemn moment, and after a proper offering to the gods, could guests start to drink the divine drink of Dionysos. But some guests already snuck a cup or two, because the heat of the hall was great, and the wine, brought straight from the cellars, was deliciously cool. The servants rushed about removing the remnants of the food and setting up wine jars and drinking goblets. In confusion, one of the beautiful Syrian boys ministering to Koreos stumbled and poured out the contents of the vase he was holding on his master's mantle. And then a terrible thing happened. The poor little slave turned pale and backed away half a step, trembling, muttering some incomprehensible words. Polynikos did not hear those words, but instead he saw Koreos' face suddenly turn purple with rage. A muffled roar escaped his massive throat, while his hand grabbed a heavy alabaster goblet and struck the boy on the head. There was a short cry, a thud of the boy's head hitting the floor, and silence. Guests jumped up from their seats. The violence shocked everyone, but no one dared say a word. Koreos calmed down a bit.
"Forgive me, my friends," he said. "Forgive me. His awkwardness made me angry." He turned to his retinue. "Take this thing away."
He kicked the body slumped before him.
"And bring me a new cloak."
And he sat down heavily in his armchair. The guests followed his example. They slowly returned to their places. Conversations began again. Only Hipponax put away his scroll.
"I don't read my poetry in slaughterhouses," he said contemptuously.
Polynikos sat numb. He was deathly pale. Red blotches appeared on his face. His hands trembled. He watched, spellbound, as Koreos brushed his soiled cloak with the back of his hand, and the servants dragged the little Syrian away, his lovely head hanging down limply, and others wiped the fresh blood from the marble floor. And then, suddenly, Polynikos felt something inside him surge, some kind of irresistible wave rising from his depths, a wave of blind, inexorable hatred choking his throat, squeezing his larynx, turning the whole world red before his eyes. Then he saw the whole world drop away and grow silent. Only one thing was now in front of his eyes. He got up and walked calmly, slowly, to the table at which Koreos sat, took hold of that same alabaster goblet, and, with all his might, smashed it straight into the huge, sweaty mouth. Someone screamed. Someone laughed, a short, spasmodic laugh. Polynikos stood motionless for a moment, squinting his pale blue eyes. Then he returned to his seat, not stopped by anyone. Chilon and Cleomenes jumped up from their chairs, grabbing his shoulders. "What have you done, you madman?" they whispered in terror. And Hipponax regarded him seriously for a moment, then suddenly clapped his hands. "Our quick runner got quickly drunk," he shouted. "Drunk on his first cup." And leaning over to Polynikos, he whispered, "Go, quick, go. Take him away, Athenians." "He got drunk," repeated the others after Hipponax.
"He is drunk,"
announced Callias, who suddenly appeared at their side as if sprung from underground. Chilon and Cleomenes, taking Polynikos by the shoulders, led him away. Polynikos walked, stunned, not knowing where he was going and why. Callias pushed him from behind.
"Hurry up, you madman! Hurry up! Get out of here while you still can!"
With Polynikos' sudden departure, all attention turned to Koreos. The merchant looked terrible. Blood gushed from his mouth and ran down his beard. He spat broken teeth. His face was purple with shock and pain, his veins engorged. His eyes, always protruding, now seemed to pop out of his head. At first he called for his entourage, but now he was unable to give orders.
"I can't breathe," he snorted.
A crowd of friends and servants surrounded him. Some were tearing open the robes on his chest, and others sprinkled water in his face. All shouted frantically. Callias mingled with this crowd, surreptitiously making sure that Polynikos had left the room. Polynikos walked through the courtyard, hauled by the two Athenians. Servants and slaves parted before them, assuming that one of the revellers had fainted and was returning home. And Polynikos did seem sick. He was pale as a corpse. His lips had turned grey and numb, and he was unable to speak. His whole body trembled. They went out into the street. "What have you done, madman?" Cleomenes whispered.
"I did it all wrong,"
stammered out Polynikos.
"I did not bust open that ugly head."
"If you had, you wouldn't have left that Megaron alive, and I wouldn't give a broken obol for your skin." Chilon said, "Cleomenes, go back to the feast. You don't need to be seen with him. And you,
Me? I am an old man. I am safe. They won't dare raise a hand against me.
But at that moment, a fourth man caught up with them. It was Callias, out of breath, gasping like forge bellows.
"Go back, Athenians," he said. "Go back. I'll bring this. I'll take him away."
Possibly for the first time in his life, Callias was lost for words.
"Are you a friend of his?"
"Oh, gods, unfortunately, yes. The vengeful gods decided to punish me with his friendship, but yes, I am."
"Then explain to him that he must not stay in Corinth a moment longer. Do you understand?"
"Do I understand? By Hermes! He will be at sea in an hour, or I am not Callias."
"Better in half an hour."
"Yes, better, Athenians."
They broke up. Suddenly, Polynikos, pulled by Callias, stopped.
"Why am I supposed to run away? What did I do? Tell me."
Callias raised both hands to the heavens.
"Oh, gods," he groaned. "He's asking why. He broke an alabaster goblet in the face of the most worthy citizen of Corinth. He insulted a member of the council and the brother of the governor of the city, and now he asks why he must leave. Have you noticed, fool, that no one dared say a word when this scoundrel killed his slave? Nobody. Understand? Nobody. He killed a child in a symposium. He offended the gods. He offended the host and the guests, and no one said a thing."
"It wasn't about insulting, Callias. It was... Have you seen that boy, Callias?"
"And what do you care about someone else's slave? Fool! Fool! 3 times fool!"
"Don't insult me, Callias, I ask you. Not now. I am not at my best at the moment." Polynikos was irritated.
All right, smart chiton. But you should know that you got out of there alive only thanks to me."
"How's that?"
"Oh, yes, simple soul. As we left the Megaron, Agamemnes was giving orders to detain you.
But I grabbed his arm. 'Don't do this, Agamemnes,' I said."
"And Agamemnes obeyed you?"
"Yes, because I told him you were the son of a prince and the nephew of Polycrates of Samos. You know, the nephew of Polycrates. Ha!"
"I?"
"Yes, you."
Polynikos was so astonished that he allowed himself to be pulled along.
"But that's not true," he whispered.
"Of course it isn't." But Agamemnes froze when he heard it, uncertain what to do, and that's all the time we needed to get out. He can imprison a hero of the games, but arrest a relative of the richest prince in Hellas? Agamemnes would not dare do that, would he?
"Good, but none of this is true."
"Of course it's not true, spring onion. But before they realise that I gave them a load of hogwash, half an hour will pass, an hour maybe, and it's all we need. Maybe they don't know exactly where you are staying, and maybe they won't find it quickly." He froze. "By all gods, I believe I hear pursuit."
They listened for a while, but heard nothing. Callias breathed out hard.
"Yes, I sacrifice myself for you. I lie like your natural father, and you won't even let me call you a fool. Oh, justice."
"Forgive me, Callias, but what will happen now when that turns out to be untrue?"
Callias shrugged.
"What can happen? I will say that I was mistaken, and that's it. Who might not lose his head in such confusion? Anyway, Polycrates really has a nephew with a similar name. Yes, Polydoros. Exactly. Polydoros, Polycrates, Polynikos. Who can keep all these Samian names straight? Don't you worry now. They won't touch a hair on my head. But it would be better if I were not seen in your company. So, for Hermes' sake, can you move your feet? Which one of us is the champion runner? But why should I run away like a thief at night? Insisted Polynikos. Oh, gods. If you were my son... No, that would be too scary. Get this. One brother of Chaereos is the governor of Corinth. Another is the captain of the guards. And he himself has 200 slaves, plus mercenaries and servants. Plus, they are Creonids, and Creonids never forgive the slightest offence, let alone knocked out teeth. Do not say one word more, Polynikos. Please, don't tease me. When he found out what had happened, Melocles immediately realized that there was no time to lose. He took command of his comrades and woke Diossos, sending him out to stand sentry at the street corner. He ordered the steersman to rush to the boat and prepare it for departure, while he and Polynikos began packing their belongings. Polynikos was trembling. "Melocles," he complained, "why do we have to run? Think about it. All those triumphs yesterday, and now we run like thieves." Melocles said nothing. He was stuffing their things in a large bag. "Melocles, are you also angry with me like Callias? Melocles!" Melocles grabbed him by the arm. "No, I am not angry with you at all. You did beautifully, and I would probably have done the same thing. Just do not ask me now why we should run. Not now. Now we run, then we talk, yes?" "Hurry up!" Callias urged them from the entrance, looking out into the street again and again. Diossos' mother emerged from the adjoining room, and with her the frightened and trembling Euclea. Melocles settled the bill and said, "Keep these jugs and cups as souvenirs, and remember us well," he said, as he went out. Euclea raised her terrified eyes to Polynikos. "Are you leaving, my lord?" she asked. Polynikos stared at her, still flushed and warm from sleep, with her hair in disarray, tears in her eyes, her lips quivering pitifully. She seemed to him so lovely, so very lovely, so dear that he felt a sudden tightness in his throat, and could not speak a word. "I'm leaving," he whispered in a choked voice. "And you won't be back?" Polynikos grabbed her hand. "I will be back, by Zeus. I will be back. I will be back for you, girl." "Polynikos! Polynikos!" Melocles called from outside. Polynikos ran out of the room. Half an hour later, the Milesian boat left the harbour. Euclea stood on the shore, staring out into the darkness. The shadow of Diossos approached her. "Oh, Euclea, will they come back? Tell me, they will come back, yes?" "I don't know, Diossos. I don't know."